Good evening, everyone, and welcome once again to Bhagavad-gita Satsang. I'm Hari-kirtana. It's an honor to be here with you and a pleasure to have you here with me. No, it's an honor to have you here with me and a pleasure for me to be here with you. Okay, glad we got that straight. And now that we have that straight, please do me the favor of confirming that you can hear my inversions of etiquette by raising your hands. Thank you very much for confirming that I can be heard. And with that, I will resume sharing my screen so that I can make more errors. These housekeeping tips for you who are new to the satsang: adjust your audio settings and your viewing options up in the upper right-hand corner. You need not worry about your mic or your video camera because you can see, or at least hear me, and I cannot see or hear you. But if you would like to be heard, please comment or offer up a question in the chat box or in the Q&A box, and I will do my best to keep an eye on both of them. Meanwhile, our last class, chapter 13, the yoga of reflection on spirit and matter. We heard Krishna's definition of knowledge. We are about to hear Krishna's definition of everything else. We covered verses 7 through 9 by my count, but in this chapter we have an introductory verse that either doesn't appear in some editions or is counted as the first verse in other editions, or is there but not counted as the first verse in some other editions. So by my count, we are in verses, we cover verses 7 through 9. By yours, it may have been 8 through 10. And we will continue this evening by concluding Krishna's definition of knowledge and what is not knowledge, and move on to a description of Brahman, the spiritual ground of being, along with a description of Paramatma, the localized expansion of the Supreme Person within the heart of all beings, and we'll start to see how they are one and yet different as we move through these verses. And this oneness and difference is seen in the paradoxical features of Upanishadic language, which is what Krishna is about to start using. So this will play into the kind of esoteric understanding of the features of divinity that allow for action without the normal accoutrements of action that we expect some actor to have, and also plays into, therefore, the personal and impersonal aspects of the absolute truth. So that's what we're going to do this evening. And before we do any of it, we will chant our invocation mantra. If you are new to this mantra, the dot over the M indicates that we close the back tongue up against the back of the roof of our mouth at the same time that we bring our lips together in front. The bar across a vowel, in this case an A, indicates a long and an open version of that vowel, as opposed to a vowel without such a bar, in which case a truncated or abbreviated version of that vowel is chanted. So I chant, you chant back. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Our translation, I offer my respects to the Supreme Person, the Son of Vasudeva, who is the all-pervading transcendence. All right. Last week, we heard that according to Krishna, knowledge is a proper understanding of what the field is and who the knower of the field are. The field, meaning the field of activity, or the body, the coherent organization of senses and their interactions with sense objects, which all undergo transformations in relationship to one another. So understanding the distinction, once again, between the body and the person within the body is knowledge, as opposed to knowing the ins and outs of the actions of the field activity. In a conventional sense, most people think of knowledge as understanding how things work, how you can get what you want, because knowledge is power. And we assume that what we want is the power to satisfy the senses. Therefore, understanding the ins and outs of the interactions of matter and how to exercise some control over nature in order to exploit material nature for the sake of our enjoyment, that's considered knowledge in a mundane sense. And Krishna is rejecting this idea of knowledge. As we move forward, we will hear the rest of Krishna's description of states of being that are either prerequisites for knowledge or symptoms of knowledge. And we're going to cover verses 10 and 11 in chapter 13 to finish up this description of the symptoms or prerequisites for knowledge, and then move on to verses 12 through 14. We will get to the Upanishadic language that describes Brahman and Paramatma. So here we go. All right, so we left off with, I'll go back and cover verses 7 through 9 first, just for review, just to hear them again, and then I'll get into the details in 10 and 11. So starting with verse 7, or perhaps verse 8 in your copy of the Bhagavad-gita, humility, non-duplicity, violence, tolerance, simplicity, honoring one's spiritual teacher, cleanliness, steadiness, self-control, dispassion for the objects of the senses, absence of egoism, along with an awareness of the suffering associated with the flaw of birth, death, old age, and disease, detachment, freedom from entanglements of children, a spouse, a home, and the rest, equanimity in both desirable and undesirable situations. Last week, of course, we went into the details of what these things really mean and signify. So our next verse is, by my count, verse 10. Constant and exclusive devotion to me, aspiring to live in a secluded place, disinterest in social gatherings. And then verse 11, consistently prioritizing the pursuit of self-realization and seeing the value of the philosophical search for the truth. This I declare to be knowledge, and all that is contrary to this is ignorance. So when you think about it, this is a relatively short list of things that constitute knowledge, meaning that you would have a much longer list of things that constitute ignorance. And I suppose you could make that list if you really wanted to, but I think it would be a lot simpler to stick to the list of knowledge and on that, the positive, rather than worry too much about how the top 20 guitar openings of rock and roll songs doesn't really constitute knowledge, much to my chagrin and dismay. Anyway, let's go back and chant this next verse, verse 10. So a little more about the diacritical marks in the transliterated Sanskrit. The dot under an N indicates that the N sound is the back of one's tongue up against the back portion of the roof of one's mouth. So it almost comes out like an NG sound, a little more sound out of your nose as opposed to an N, so you place your tongue behind the back of your teeth. An accent mark over an S indicates an SH sound made from the back of one's mouth, opposed to a regular SH sound, which would occur when you see a dot under an S. Shh. So slightly lower pitch because it's farther back in your mouth. And that's it for diacritical marks in this verse. So I will chant each line, and if you like, you can chant each line back. Here we go. Mai chan anya yogena bhaktir avya vicharani vivikta desha sevitvam arati jananam sadi. Translation. Constant and exclusive devotion to me, aspiring to live in a secluded place, disinterest in social gatherings. Let's take a look at some of the key words in this verse. Mai means unto me. Also, ananya yogena, union by exclusive engagement, bhakti, of devotional service. Avya vicharani means without any break, unwavering. All right. So continuing with our mode of inquiry from last time, we asked the question, why is this considered to be knowledge or a symptom of knowledge or prerequisite of foreknowledge? Because bhakti yoga is the means to achieving the ultimate goal of life and is the goal of life itself. Bhakti, as Krishna has made clear in previous verses and previous chapters, is the only means to attain Krishna. And all other benefits, material and spiritual, are attained exclusively by bhakti yoga. Now, that doesn't mean, exclusively means that all you have to do is practice bhakti yoga. And with the other paths of yoga, what that means is you have to add bhakti in order for that path of yoga to reach its ultimate fulfillment, for it to complete. So the objectives of other paths of yoga are reached when bhakti is activated within that path of yoga. So Krishna, having made it clear that he is the goal of knowledge, therefore says, devotion to me, the means by which you can know me, is a symptom of knowledge, and because the process of bhakti and is bhakti itself, so it is a means to an end and an end of itself, then constant and exclusive devotion to Krishna is the means by which one attains knowledge of Krishna and, by extension, knowledge of oneself. The next, aspiring to live in a secluded place. So vivikta means solitary, desha, place, sevitvam, aspiring, aratihi, being without attachment. So aspiring to solitary places, and then jana samsadi, to people in general, so being without attachment to people in general. All right. Is Krishna telling us to be antisocial? Well, yes and no. It is challenging, difficult to engage in yoga of any kind when one is in an environment that is not conducive to yoga. And so this makes it particularly challenging for those of us who live in cities. I live in a city. I'm very fortunate. I live in a city that has spaces, areas of the city that are pretty quiet and pastoral, and I'm fortunate enough to live in such an area of the city. But the idea is that one should not be in a place where there's lots of materially motivated activity going on. We've spoken in earlier classes about set and setting. So your setting, your environment actually has a big impact on your consciousness. And therefore it's incumbent upon us to go out of our way to adjust our setting as best we can in order to make it as conducive as possible for the pursuit of spiritual life. So the solitary place, at least as solitary as we can get in modern life, and still engage with the world in a constructive way, or at least a necessary way, in order to provide for our livelihoods, educate our children, etc. So the next one, without attachment to people in general. So that doesn't mean that you don't engage with people at all, that you avoid people. But it means that your engagement is practical and hopefully beneficial to those you interact with on a spiritual level. The general mass of people are not particularly interested in making progress on the path of spiritual life. And so if we if we become overly attached to engaging with people who have no interest in spiritual life, then we will be distracted ourselves from our own pursuit of spiritual life. We are contemplating doing some renovation to our kitchen. And we're working with a designer, someone who does not just interior design, but more like structural design, to see what's possible, what will work in the amount of space that we have based on the kind of building we live in, and all that sort of thing. And had a magazine, the kind of magazine that people who do this kind of work are likely to have, that have lots of examples of very nice kitchen renovations. And this particular magazine was a very upscale magazine. I mean, it had a lot of examples that were clearly in homes that were worth $1 zillion that, we're just not thinking anything in this scale. So the idea was to just get ideas of what might look good and what might work in our space. And after everyone left, I looked at the magazine and I looked at all the examples of renovated kitchens in $1 zillion houses and renovated living spaces, $1 zillion houses, and outdoor spaces with all these different kinds of pools and places to hang out and such. And it occurred to me that the purpose of this magazine was to make the reader envious of what someone else had, so that they would desire something like that. And I remember reading somewhere that according to modern psychology, envy is the #1 motivator for people to do things. People actually get motivated to acquire on the basis of envying what others have. Anyway, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not sure exactly how that works, but this is what can happen when we are engaged with people or interacting with people who are motivated by material desires, then those material desires will rub off on us. So how do we do that? Well, a certain amount of withdrawal, a divestment in those relationships just has to happen. Now, it doesn't mean you don't engage with people, because these people are likely to be members of your family. And now ask yourself, how do friends and family react when you get serious about a spiritual path that they're not attracted to? It's sometimes supportive, as long as it doesn't interfere with their relationship with you, their way of interacting with you. In some cases, if one on a spiritual path decides that they are going to only eat vegetarian food or become vegan or something like that, that can be disruptive. Food is a very important part of family interactions, expressions of love, such like that. If it means you're not going to spend as much time with them, if it means that you're not going to share their same interests, people feel like you're invalidating their values. And so it's spiritual aspirations aren't always well received when they mean that there's going to be a transformation. So it just means that you look for what is called yukta vairagya, or appropriate detachment. That is to say, you reframe your relationships so that your most important investments are in relationships that are with people who share your sense of prioritizing the pursuit of self-realization, so that you get reinforcement from people that you hang out with for your own spiritual aspirations. And so you can be of service to others in helping them make progress along that same path and maintain the same kind of priority in our lives. So, if you have any questions about this idea of attenuating relationships with materially minded people, or how you adjust your living situations so that you're in a peaceful enough environment to be able to engage in spiritual practices, please pop them in the chat or in the Q&A box. And while I wait for your questions, I will resume sharing the screen so that we can chant the next verse. Additional notes on the pronunciation. A tilde over an N is a nya sound, so the middle of one's tongue up against the middle of the roof of one's mouth, and a little bit of body English, like a little Y action on that. When the tilde appears over an N after a J, the J sound is transformed from a J sound to a G sound. So jnana would be the pronunciation. The second of the first line of this verse. You'll also find each of these lines has that exact same situation with the tilde to the J. The apostrophe before a consonant indicates a vowel has been dropped as a matter of euphonic combination to allow for the vowel at the end of the word prior to roll directly into the word where the apostrophe appears. And I think that covers it. So here we go. I will chant. You can chant back. Adhyatma jnana nityatvam tattva jnanartha darshanam ettajnanam iti proktam ajnanam yad atonyata. Translation: consistently prioritizing pursuit of self-realization and seeing the value of the philosophical search for the truth. This I declare to be knowledge, and all that is contrary to this is ignorance. So let's go back. Take a look at the Sanskrit once again. Adhyatma means pertaining to the self. Adi, atma. So that's a compound word, atma meaning self or soul. So adhyatma means pertaining to, adi pertaining to atma, the self. Jnana, knowledge or in knowledge. And nityatvam, constancy. So nitya means eternal. Nityatvam means constant, ongoing. So Y is constant pursuit of knowledge pertaining to the self, or consistently prioritizing the pursuit of self-realization. Why is this knowledge? Because if you don't know who you are, then what good is any other knowledge? The first and foremost piece of information we need in order to know what to do is we need to know who we are. And we see how people's sense of identity determines what they do, how they act in the world. How we respond to our destiny is dictated by who we think we are or what we think we are. This is a very helpful way to look at the world, and especially the modern world here in America, although I suppose it would work anywhere, our political situation. We see how people act based on their sense of identity. And this identity politics has been emphasized as of late. And from the standpoint of yoga, it would more rightly be called the politics, misidentity politics, the politics of misidentity, thinking oneself as that which they are not, at least from the standpoint of their true eternal spirit identity. Now, This doesn't invalidate the birth that we've taken according to our karma. We all have a particular conditional identity. But that conditional identity, who we are in this life, in this body, with this particular set of senses, this mind, this particular set of aptitudes or inclinations to be this way or that way. You know, that's all valid, but it rests within the context of a bigger spiritual picture, just like the entire material world sits within the context of the spiritual world. When we contextualize our conditional dharma within the frame of reference of our spiritual or constitutional dharma, then it once again changes how we respond to our destiny, where it actually broadens the scope of how we respond to our destiny. Whereas if we are limited to the conditional identity that comes with this mind and body, then we get a very narrow field of activity. So in this way, understanding the knower of the field of activities and its actual relationship to the field of activities is very empowering. It broadens the whole bandwidth of how one can act. It's liberating. It's yoga, it's liberating, duh. Okay. The next part of this verse, tattva jnana, means of knowledge of the truth. Artha, for the object, darshanam, philosophy. So, seeing the value of the philosophical search for the truth. Tattva means truth or an element of reality, a real thing. So jnana tattva means to have knowledge of reality. So why would seeing the value of the philosophical understanding of reality, why is this knowledge or the prerequisite for knowledge or a symptom of knowledge? Because philosophy is the systematic study of relationships, actions, and the ultimate goal of life. We have three categories of knowledge in the Vedic system: knowledge of relationships, knowledge of practices, and knowledge of the ultimate goal. So to ignore the pursuit of the truth is to live in untruth, is to live in non-reality, is basically to accept living in the matrix. And once you get the idea that you might be living in non-reality, you look at the world and you think something is wrong with the picture. What is it? And then we hear from Krishna and Bhagavad-gita what it is that we feel is not quite right. It's very, very hard to back. And if you actually understand it, there's no reason why you would want to go back. Even though the journey forward to living truthfully is challenging, still, really no way to go but forward at this point. This is satyam, truthfulness, from the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. Truthfulness doesn't just mean telling the truth. Truthfulness means pursuing an understanding of what the truth is, and then having had some sense of that understanding, acting on the basis of that truth, even when it's difficult to do so. Okay, so the last portion of this verse, etat means all this, jnanam, knowledge, iti, thus, proktam, declared. I declare this to be knowledge. Ajnanam, so is a negating prefix, So jnana means knowledge. Ajnana means the absence of knowledge or ignorance. Yat, that which. Ata, from this. Anyata, other. Whatever is other than what I have listed here, that is ignorance. So here the word agyam, the absence of knowledge, is pretty close to avidya, which means the inability to see. So these are related terms that can be used as synonyms. They can be translated the same way. Not knowing or not seeing, not experiencing things as they are. All right. And that takes us to the end of this section. Krishna's explanation of what is knowledge and what is not, the much longer list being, of course, is not. And that's great because that gives us a way to focus our attention on the short list of knowledge and ignore the rest. Very good thing in a world that seeks to distract us in every possible way. So, if you have any questions about anything in this verse or in the last two verses, as we wrapped up Krishna's list of what constitutes knowledge, or symptoms of knowledge or prerequisites for knowledge, please go ahead, put them in the chat or in the Q&A box. Either way, I will see them. Meanwhile, this next cluster of verses, beginning with 12, or in some of your editions, possibly verse 13, Krishna is going to speak about Brahman and Paramatma. The substratum of existence, the spiritual stuff of which everything is ultimately made, including us, and the localized aspect of the Supreme Person within everything and everyone. And there's going to be a little bit of overlap here. The language that Krishna is using in these verses is language that also appears in the Upanishads. That is to say, it's very similar to how the Upanishads describe the indescribable. The language we use to describe that which is beyond the limits of language, and yet that we have to use language to describe in order to give us a map, some sense of direction about where we're going. So verse 12, translation. Krishna continues, now I will explain the knowable, knowing which one tastes the nectar of immortality. The beginningless spiritual substratum of existence, Brahman, which is subordinate to me, is said to be neither existing nor non-existent, for it lies beyond cause and effect of this material world. So this is pretty tricky territory if you have to speak about something as both existing or non-existing, or you can't speak about it as either existing or non-existing. How do you speak about it then? Well, that's a problem that is kind of inferred in this, and that this is a very difficult thing to understand and to articulate. So in this verse, the word amritam indicates nectar, amrita, and it specifically indicates the nectar immortality. In other words, the sweetness, the wonder of experiencing ourselves as being eternal spiritual beings, as opposed to experiencing ourselves as these temporary material bodies. So this refers directly to the immortal soul, beyond the limits of material life, that is to say, death, old age, disease, etc. Now, here's an interesting thing about how Krishna speaks about Brahman in this verse. It says that Brahman lies beyond the cause and effect of this material world. And yet, Brahman is described in the Vedanta Sutra as the cause of this world. So beyond the cause, beyond the effect, and yet, at the same time, the cause. So in the Vedanta Sutras, we find these two sutras at the very beginning, atato brahma jigyasya janmadyasya yataha, which means now, ata, try to understand Brahman, Brahma, the absolute truth. And then in the second sutra, the definition of Brahma is given as that from which, or from whom, all things proceed. The actual word here is Brahma jigyasa, understand Brahman. Who is Brahman? Janma adi, birth, etc. Birth, death, creation, maintenance, destruction of the world. Asya yataha, that which, or from whom, everything comes. So we hear at once that our journey to the ultimate conclusion of knowledge, Danta means the conclusion of knowledge, commences with the proposition that there is an absolute truth and that the absolute truth is the source of everything. And yet here we have Krishna saying that this same absolute truth that is the source of everything is beyond the cause and effect of this material world. Which Brahman are we talking about? The word Brahman is used in a few different contexts, and to understand which context or which aspect of Brahman Krishna is speaking about is essential to understanding this verse, which is kind of odd given that Brahman is assumed to be an undifferentiated spiritual substance. And yet we can speak about Brahman in different ways. So for example, Brahman is sometimes spoken about as the essence of the individual knower of the field. That is to say, we are Brahman insofar as we are spiritual. We are made of the same essential spiritual quality as Krishna himself, the Para-Brahman or Ananda-Brahman. So the supreme Brahman, from whom the world is an emanation, is described as Ananda-Brahman or Para-Brahman. Whereas the Vijnana-Brahman, the Brahman who is the knower of the field, Vijnana, the experiencer of the field of activities, is individual Atma, the individual soul. The individual soul never comes into being or goes out of being. We learned that in the second chapter. It is the true nature of all living beings, the essential aspect, the essential quality of a living being. So this is also confirmed directly in the Upanishads, in the Katha Upanishad. There's a verse that sounds very much like a verse from the Bhagavad-gita, indicating that the living being, you and I, we never come into being, we never go out of being. Our true nature is to be eternal. That is to say, in this sense, we are Brahman. However, this Brahman is subordinate to Krishna. Now, Brahman is subordinate to Krishna in two ways. One, we are subordinate as infinitesimal parts of an infinite complete whole. but also Krishna will indicate that he is the basis for Brahman, that the impersonal aspect is subordinate to the personal aspect of the absolute truth. So Brahman, as neither can't be spoken of as either existing or as not existing. Well, we, in one sense, do not have a factual material existence. That is to say, our pure spiritual consciousness never actually becomes this body or this mind. Therefore, we cannot be said to exist from a material standpoint. We never actually become the body. It's not possible for spirit to become matter unless you're Krishna, who can transform spirit into matter for the sake of facilitating the individual spirit souls or atmas who wish to have the illusion of separation from Krishna, in which case matter covers one's spiritual senses and Krishna disappears from view. This is the inconceivable potency of the Supreme Person, that the Supreme Person can take his own divine energy and transform it without being transformed himself in the process. So, the classic example of this is a clay pot and a potter. When a potter takes clay and turns it into a clay pot, the potter is not transformed in the process. And the clay has also not been changed to a substance other than clay. The shape of the clay has been changed, and maybe there's a glaze on it too, and it goes in the oven and heats up and all that. But the substance of which the pot is made is still clay. So in order to understand clay pots, you need to understand clay, the substance of which the clay pot is made. The analogy only works if the Supreme Person is both personal and impersonal. Here's what I mean. Brahman is the substance of the world, and the world comes into being by virtue of a transformation of the energies of Brahman. That is to say, the material cause of a clay pot is clay, and the efficient cause of a clay pot is the potter. The energy of the potter is what goes into shaping the clay into the pot. In this case, Brahman is the material cause of the material world, and Brahman is also the efficient cause, the source of the energy that, and the person who is engaging the energy in such a way as to change the shape of the clay. So you have an impersonal aspect of Brahman, the clay, and the personal aspect of Brahman, the potter, and they are both Brahman, and yet they are not exactly the same. They're two different aspects of one indivisible thing. And this is the essence of the doctrine of inconceivable simultaneous oneness and difference presented to us by Sri Chaitanya at the dawn of the 16th century, early 1500s. And this is a good lens to use to try to understand what Krishna is speaking about in this section. So we, as Brahman, are transcendental by nature, never have a actual existence in the material world. Therefore, we cannot be said to exist in the material world, but here we are, so you can't be said to not exist either. So, a paradox. Let me know if you have a question about this verse. And as we move on to the next verse, Krishna is going to change the subject a little bit to begin speaking about Param Atma, the localized aspect of the Supreme Person within the heart of all beings, and within every atomic particle of matter. So, this verse. With hands and legs everywhere, with eyes, heads, and faces everywhere, have ears everywhere in the world, all encompassing it, the Supersoul, is constant. So obviously, the subject has changed from the spiritual aspect of the G, or the Atma, or how the Atma is actually Brahman, to how the absolute truth manifests in a different way as the Parama. Obviously, we cannot say that our hands and feet are everywhere, that our faces, ears are everywhere. We're not hearing everything everywhere. So borrowing a little bit of commentary from Sri Ramanuja in this particular verse, this verse indicates the aspect of the Supreme Lord who does not have material hands and feet, and yet is able to perform all the activities of hands and feet. So in other words, the Supreme Person never has a mundane form, material form. So even without feet, he can run. Even without hands, he can pick stuff up. Even without ears, he can hear everything. This is called Para-Brahman, or Supreme Brahman. The Shvetasvatara Upanishad has a verse that echoes this same idea. Footless, handless, he moves in grass, eyeless, earless, he sees and hears. So in other words, there are senses, but they're not material senses. The Supreme Person doesn't have senses like you and I, but nonetheless has senses that can perform all of the functions of senses, but to the utmost degree. The limited sensory capacity that you and I have is just a dim little reflection of the infinite sensory capacity of Brahman. So the Atma also has the performing functions. That is to say, when we experience ourselves as pure spiritual beings, we also, because we are made of the same essential stuff, Brahman. If Brahman can see and hear and feel and walk and dance and sing, well, then so can we. The entry into spiritual existence is not devoid of sensory experience, but rather the awakening of spiritual senses, which are categorically different from a material sense. Otherwise, there would be no possibility of a coherent spiritual experience. And it might be really boring. All right. Questions? Please pop them up into the chat. Meanwhile, we have just enough time to chant one more verse, and here it is. C's in transliterated Sanskrit are CH sounds, cha. So anytime you see a C, it's going to be a CH, and if you see an H after a C, then you put a little air after the CH sound. And other than that, I've already covered the diacritical marks that act as pronunciation cues. So once again, I'll chant each line. You can chant each line if you like. Sarvendriya gunabhasam Sarvendriya vivarjitam Asaktam sarva bhrikshaiva nirgunam guna bhoktracha Translation, the original source of all senses, yet devoid of all senses. Unattached, yet the maintainer of all. Free of qualities born of material nature, and at the same time, the master of all the qualities of material nature. And we've got a cliffhanger, because this verse will continue on into the next verse. Krishna here is going to be speaking about himself as the Supersoul in the third person. So this is kind of an interesting thing that has gone on throughout the Gita, that Krishna speaks of Brahman as something separate from himself, unless he specifically indicates that he is the equivalent of Brahman or the basis of Brahman. He speaks about the localized aspect of the absolute truth, Paramatma, in the third person, and then he speaks about his personal form, Bhagavan, in the first person. So nirguna is a very important word in this verse. Nir is another gating prefix. Guna means qualities, so nirguna means no qualities. And in context, the understanding, at least in Bhakti Yoga, is no material quality, not no qualities at all, but rather the absence of material qualities, or the absence of the three qualities of material nature, is called nirguna. So, in this sense, as we've already spoken about, the Paramatma, the agency, the expansion of Krishna through which stuff manifests in the material world, including all of the material senses, our senses. Therefore, the original source of all senses, but not having any material senses himself. Unattached, and yet the maintainer of all. So we want to become saintly, godlike. And Krishna, or the Supersoul, in this case, is present in the material world, but is not invested in the material world at all. Invested in us, because the Supersoul accompanies us wherever we go in the material world, but not invested in the material world or the stuff that we get entangled with in the course of engaging with the material world. Therefore, maintainer of everyone, but not attached to what's going on here. Free of the qualities born in material nature, and at the same time, the master of the qualities. So Krishna has already indicated this in a previous verse. Daivi hira gunamayi, divine energy of mind. It's very difficult to overcome, but anyone who surrenders to me can easily cross beyond it. Why? Because he is the master of material nature, and so can easily call it off. Developing knowledge of the Supersoul leads to an awakening of our spiritual vision, and therefore deeper experiential understanding of how all this works. And we'll go a little deeper into this verse and the verses that follow when we pick up next week. So if you have any questions about what we've covered so far, last call on questions in the chat box or the Q&A. What we covered this evening is the conclusion of Krishna's definition of knowledge as states of being or prerequisites of knowledge or indications of knowledge. We began our description of Brahman, the spiritual ground of all being, and the Paramatma, the localized aspect, and we spoke a little bit about the paradoxical features of Upanishadic language and how to understand what these paradoxes are indicating to us. We cover verses 10 through 14 of the 13th chapter. If you have questions after the fact, please email me, Hari at Hari-kirtana.com. I'll be happy to hear from you and entertain any questions that you have, or simply hear any realizations or insights that you have gotten from studying these verses. Next week, we will continue with chapter 13, the yoga of reflection on spirit and matter. We'll talk about how the light in me is the light in you. And we may wander off into a pet peeve if I'm not careful. We'll talk about material nature as the cause of effects, the soul as the cause of effects, and the soul and material nature and their interactions. We will cover verses 15 through 21 by my count, maybe 16 through 22 in your edition of the Gita. And that's it for this evening. I thank you so very, very much for joining me here. Those of you who have so kindly joined me in real time this evening, I'm very happy to see you all. I'm very grateful for your spending your time with me. And for those of you joining me after the fact, I am also very grateful for your choosing to spend your time with me. You have a wonderful rest of your evening, and I look forward to seeing you all next time. Have a nice night.